The sand tasted like copper and ash. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb pressed his face into the dirt as rounds snapped overhead, close enough that he felt the pressure wave of each bullet's passage against his scalp. His radio was dead. His rifle jammed 3 magazines ago. Blood seeped through the makeshift tourniquet on his left thigh, darkening the Afghan dust beneath him. He'd been separated from his squad for 40 minutes, long enough to watch the sun climb higher, long enough to count his remaining heartbeats like a miser counting his last coins. The Taliban fighters were closing in from 3 sides, their voices carrying across the valley floor with the casual confidence of men who knew their prey was cornered. Webb's lips moved silently, forming words his grandmother had taught him in a Kentucky church 30 years ago. He wasn't particularly religious, but when a man counts his last minutes, he remembers the prayers of his childhood. The sky above was impossibly blue, the kind of blue that appeared in travel brochures about exotic destinations. It seemed obscene that something so beautiful could frame his final moments. Then he heard it, a sound like tearing canvas, like God clearing his throat. It started as a distant growl, low and mean, building into something that made the ground vibrate. Webb knew that sound. Every infantryman who'd served in Iraq or Afghanistan knew that sound. But knowing it and believing it would come for him were different things entirely. He'd called for close air support 17 minutes ago, before his radio died. The Tactical Operations Center had acknowledged but provided no confirmation. No aircraft available in sector. Hold position. As if he had a choice. The engine sound grew louder and Webb tilted his head just enough to see the ridgeline to his north. That's when it appeared low enough that he could see the battle damage, the missing panels on the right wing, the scorched engine cowling, the landing gear that hung at an unnatural angle. An A-10 Thunderbolt, flying like a wounded hawk that refused to die. The aircraft came in perpendicular to the valley axis, moving at barely 200 knots, which for a jet was practically hovering. Webb could see straight into the cockpit, could see the helmet of the pilot who'd just become either his salvation or his witness. The Taliban fighters saw it too. Their shooting intensified, tracers arcing upward in desperate streams of green and white. The A-10 didn't climb or evade. It rolled slightly left, adjusted its angle, and Webb saw the nose flash. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon spoke with a voice that ended conversations. 70 rounds per second, each projectile the size of a beer bottle, designed to destroy Soviet tanks. Against human targets in the open, it was apocalyptic. The Earth erupted in a precise line 50 meters ahead of Webb's position, then walked methodically toward the enemy fighters. The sound hit him a half-second after the visual, a deep, tearing brrrrrt that resonated in his chest cavity, in his teeth, in the spaces between his vertebrae. Dust and smoke obscured everything. Rocks and equipment fragments fountained upward. When the dust settled, the Taliban position was a smoking scar across the landscape. The A-10 climbed banking hard right despite the obvious damage to its airframe. Webb watched it circle, impossibly graceful despite missing God knew how many critical components. His radio crackled, battery dying, but enough juice for one more transmission. "Ground unit, this is Reaper 1-1. Can you move?" The voice was calm, almost gentle, female. Webb tried to respond, coughed blood instead. His vision was tunneling. He keyed the mic twice, the universal signal for acknowledgement when speaking was impossible. "Copy, 2 clicks. Stay down. I've got you." The A-10 made another pass, this time using its remaining Maverick missile on a technical truck Webb hadn't even seen approaching from the east. The explosion rolled across the valley like summer thunder. Webb's eyes closed. He wasn't sure if he was dying or just exhausted, probably both. But that voice on the radio had spoken with absolute certainty. "I've got you. Not we'll try or hang in there." Just a simple promise from a pilot in a devastated aircraft who had no business still being airborne. He let himself believe it. The medevac arrived 19 minutes later, guided in by an A-10 that was flying on one engine, leaking hydraulic fluid, and missing most of its right horizontal stabilizer. The helicopter crew worked with urgent efficiency, loading Webb onto a stretcher while the Thunderbolt circled overhead like a guardian angel carved from titanium and spite. One of the paramedics looked up, shielding his eyes against the sun. That pilot's insane. That aircraft should have been a fireball 10 minutes ago. His partner didn't respond, too focused on getting an IV into Webb's arm. But Webb heard. Through the haze of shock and blood loss, he heard. And he wondered who flew like that, who stayed over a danger zone in a dying aircraft because one soldier on the ground needed them to stay. The helicopter lifted off, and Webb caught one last glimpse of the A-10 through the open door. It was turning south, toward Bagram, trailing smoke like a banner. He tried to ask the crew who the pilot was, but his voice wouldn't work anymore. The morphine was kicking in, pulling him down into darkness. His last conscious thought was a question he wouldn't be able to ask for 3 more days. Who was Reaper 11? At Bagram Air Base, the tower controller watched the crippled A-10 approach with something approaching religious awe. The aircraft was a testament to the aircraft type's legendary durability, but it was also a flying miracle that defied several laws of physics and aerodynamics. Reaper 11 Bagram Tower. We have emergency equipment standing by. Confirm you have control. The response came back steady, almost bored. Bagram, Reaper 11. Control is marginal but sufficient. Landing gear is mechanical backup only. Right main is uncertain. Recommend full emergency response. The controller watched the aircraft line up on final approach. Even from 3 miles out, he could see the damage, the missing panels, the shredded wing, the asymmetric engine thrust. Reaper 11, be advised, you are cleared to eject. Repeat, you are cleared to eject. Aircraft is expendable. There was a pause. When the voice came back, there was steel underneath the calm. Negative, Bagram. This airplane brought me home. I'm bringing it home. The controller didn't argue. He'd been working Bagram Tower for 2 years, had talked down dozens of damaged aircraft, but he recognized something in that voice, a particular type of stubbornness that couldn't be reasoned with because it wasn't unreasonable. It was just a different calculus of loyalty. The A-10 touched down hard, right main gear collapsing immediately, sending the aircraft sliding sideways in a spray of sparks and shredded metal. Fire trucks raced alongside, foam already spraying. The aircraft skidded 1,500 feet before coming to rest at the edge of the taxiway, tilted at a sharp angle, right wing digging into the asphalt. The canopy opened immediately. The pilot climbed out without assistance, waved off the emergency crew trying to help, and walked away from the wreckage with the casual stride of someone who just parallel parked rather than survived the unsurvivable. The maintenance chief who inspected the wreckage 3 hours later counted 147 separate holes in the airframe. The right engine had been running with 2 turbine blades missing. The hydraulic system was compromised in 4 places. The flight control computer had been operating on backup power for the last 20 minutes of flight. He'd been maintaining A-10s for 15 years, and he'd never seen an aircraft take that much damage and remain controllable. Who was flying this thing? He asked the ground crew. Nobody knew. The pilot had disappeared into the debriefing system, swallowed by the post-mission bureaucracy that processed every combat sortie. But word spread anyway, the way it always does on military bases. Whispers in the mess hall, conversations between crew chiefs, stories passed from one squadron to another. Someone had brought home a dead airplane through sheer willpower and skill. Someone had stayed over a ground unit in a valley of death because leaving wasn't an option. Someone named Reaper 11 had just written themselves into the unofficial legend of close air support. The questions would come later. For now, the maintenance chief just shook his head and made notes on his clipboard, documenting damage that would eventually result in the aircraft being written off as beyond economical repair. The airplane had given its life protecting a soldier. In the strange accounting of military aviation, that was a good death for a machine. Staff Sergeant Webb woke up in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany 72 hours after extraction. His leg was saved, though he'd walk with a limp forever. His first question, asked through cracked lips to a nurse who'd seen too many wounded soldiers ask too many variations of the same question, was predictable. Who pulled me out? The nurse checked his chart. Medevac crew from the 101st. They're back in theater already. Webb shook his head, frustrated by his inability to articulate what he meant. No, the A-10. Who flew the A-10? The nurse didn't know. She promised to find out. It took 4 days and inquiries through 3 different command structures before Webb got a name. Not because it was classified, but because the Air Force bureaucracy moved at its own pace, indifferent to the urgency of a recovering infantryman's gratitude. When the information finally came, it arrived in the form of a visit from an Air Force captain who worked in casualty notification and liaison. He sat beside Webb's bed with the uncomfortable posture of someone fulfilling an obligation they didn't quite understand. "You were asking about your close air support." Webb nodded, suddenly nervous. If they'd sent someone official, maybe the pilot hadn't made it. Maybe that landing had gone worse than it looked. Captain Nora Cowery. "She's back on flight status as of yesterday." The captain pronounced the last name carefully, Corey. Webb repeated it, testing the syllables. "She okay?" Bruised ribs from the ejection seat shoulder harness. She never actually ejected, but she was pulling enough GS in that damaged state that the seat was digging in. Otherwise fine. The captain paused. "She asked about you too, wanted to know if you made it." Webb spent the next 6 weeks in recovery thinking about that detail. "She asked about you too." In the vast machinery of military operations, where individual soldiers were often just grid coordinates and friendly forces, someone had asked. Someone had flown through hell in a dying airplane and then wondered if it had been enough. He wrote a letter old-fashioned, pen on paper, the kind of thing his generation was supposed to be too digitally native to bother with. He didn't know what to say, so he said what was true. "Thank you for my life." He didn't know if she'd ever receive it. The letter went into the mail system, addressed to Captain Nora Cowery, care of her squadron at Bagram. He had no way to know if it arrived, no way to know if she read it, no way to know if words on paper could adequately convey the weight of gratitude for breathing air and seeing sunlight and having a future that extended beyond 40 minutes in the Afghan dust. But he sent it anyway, because the alternative was carrying that debt in silence, and silence was no way to honor what she'd done. Captain Nora Cowery did receive the letter. It arrived mixed in with the official mail during a squadron briefing day, sorted by an administrative specialist who had no idea what it contained. Cowery opened it in her quarters that evening, still wearing her flight suit, boots unlaced, exhausted from a 6-hour combat air patrol that had been blessedly quiet. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small fire-resistant box where she kept her important documents: her pilot's license, her commission certificate, her grandfather's military medals from another war in another desert. She didn't cry, though something in her chest loosened slightly. She'd been flying close air support for 3 years. She'd employed weapons in defense of ground forces dozens of times. But this was the first time someone had written to say it mattered. The first time the coordinates and radio calls had resolved into a specific human being who was alive specifically because of her actions on a specific day. She didn't frame it. She didn't show it to anyone. She just kept it, and sometimes, on difficult days when the missions blurred together and the violence became routine, she'd take it out and read it again. "Thank you for my life." 5 words that justified everything: the training, the danger, the fear, the exhaustion, the separation from family, the calculated risks that were never quite as calculated as the after-action reports suggested. 5 words that meant someone saw her, knew her, understood the choice she'd made to stay when leaving would have been smarter and safer and entirely justifiable. The story might have ended their pilot and saved soldier connected by one moment of crisis, then returning to separate lives in separate worlds. But the military is a surprisingly small community, especially among those who serve in combat roles. 6 months after Webb's evacuation, Cowery was reassigned stateside to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, attached to the Weapons Instructor Course as a guest instructor. Webb, medically retired from the Army with a Purple Heart and a permanent limp, was living in Las Vegas, working as a consultant for a defense contractor that specialized in tactical communications systems. The city held both of them in the same uneasy orbit of military culture and civilian life, veterans trying to translate their experiences into language that people who'd never deployed could understand. They met by accident at a symposium on close air support integration. Webb was there representing his company. Cowery was presenting a case study on weapons employment in complex terrain. She didn't use her own mission as the example, but Webb recognized the details. The valley axis, the emergency communication frequencies, the damaged aircraft that should have been unflyable. After her presentation, he waited while other attendees asked technical questions about targeting protocols and coordination procedures. When the crowd cleared, he approached with the careful hesitation of someone who wasn't sure if recognition would be welcome. "Captain Cowery," she turned, professional smile already in place, the expression she used for networking and small talk. Then she saw his face, the way he favored his left leg, and something clicked. "Staff Sergeant Webb." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd been intimately connected by violence and survival, now awkwardly meeting in a hotel conference room under fluorescent lights. The mundane setting couldn't contain what existed between them, the weight of life debt, of choices made in extremis, of the moment when one person became the entire world for another person. Webb spoke first. "You got my letter," Cowery nodded. "I did, thank you. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." His voice was firm. "I did have to." They had coffee in the hotel restaurant, conversation awkward at first, then gradually finding its rhythm. They didn't talk much about the valley, about the mission. Instead, they talked about the strangeness of civilian life, the difficulty of explaining what they'd done to people who asked what you did for a living at dinner parties. Cowery mentioned her frustration with instructing pilots who'd never been shot at, who treated close air support like a video game rather than the intimate violence it actually was. Webb talked about his work trying to fix communication systems that failed soldiers when they needed them most, driven by the memory of his own radio dying at the worst possible moment. They discovered they shared the same dark humor, the same impatience with people who thanked them for their service without having any idea what that service entailed. They became friends slowly, carefully, two people who'd started their relationship in trauma and had to learn how to know each other in peace. Coffee meetings became dinners. Dinners became hiking trips into the desert, where they could see horizons and open sky and feel less trapped by the city. Webb learned that Cowery had grown up in Michigan, daughter of Lebanese immigrants, first woman in her family to serve in the military. Her grandfather had flown reconnaissance missions in the Lebanese Civil War before emigrating. She'd learned to fly in college, joined the Air Force because she wanted to do something that mattered, and chose the A-10 because everyone told her it was ugly and outdated and that nobody wanted to fly it anymore. Cowery learned that Webb had enlisted after college specifically to escape college, his words, because he'd been studying business administration and realized he didn't want to spend his life in meetings talking about quarterly projections. He'd chosen infantry because he wanted clarity, wanted a job where the objectives were simple even if accomplishing them wasn't. He'd extended his deployment 3 times because going home felt like giving up on the soldiers who were still there. He didn't talk much about the valley, but sometimes, when they hiked into remote areas where the silence was complete, she'd see him stop and listen, and she'd know he was hearing something she couldn't: the echo of rounds snapping overhead, of his own heartbeat counting down his remaining seconds. She never asked him to elaborate. Some things didn't need words. Their friendship was built on shared understanding of the gap between who they'd been in combat and who they were trying to become after it. Neither of them was entirely successful at that transition. Cowery still dreamed about cockpit warnings, about hydraulic failures, about trying to control an aircraft that was steadily dying around her. Webb still walked with a limp that was worse on cold days, still sometimes forgot that he was safe, still reached for weapons that weren't there when he heard unexpected loud noises. They helped each other navigate the ordinary world, which turned out to be far more complicated than the combat zone where the rules were simpler. Stay alive, keep your people alive, accomplish the mission in that order. 2 years after the valley, after coffee had become dinner, had become something neither of them wanted to label but both recognized as essential, they drove out to Lake Mead on a Saturday afternoon. The water was low, It always was, the drought slowly draining the reservoir. But the sky was enormous and cloudless. They sat on the rocks near the shore, watching a sailboat tack across the blue water, and Webb finally said what he'd been carrying since the conference room meeting. "I think about it sometimes. That you could have left. Your aircraft was shot to hell. You could have climbed out, headed back to base. Nobody would have blamed you." Cowery picked up a flat stone, examined it, sent it skipping across the water with a practiced flick. 3 bounces. "I think about it too," she said. "Every version where I leave you die, every single one. I ran the math in my head while I was circling. Time to climb out, time for another aircraft to get on station, time for them to locate you. The numbers didn't work. So you stayed in a falling-apart airplane because of math," she smiled slightly. "I stayed because you needed me to stay. The math was just the excuse I used to justify it to myself." Webb considered that. "Would you do it again?" "Yes," no hesitation. "Every time. That's the job." "That's beyond the job," Cowery shook her head. "No, that is the job. People think close air support is about weapons and tactics and procedures. It's not. It's about refusing to leave. It's about being the person who stays when staying is stupid and dangerous and might kill you. Because down there, in the dirt, someone is counting on you to be that person." Webb was quiet for a long time. The sailboat disappeared around a curve in the shoreline. The sun descended toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Finally, he spoke. "I need you to understand something. I'm alive because you made a choice. Every day I have, every breath, every good thing that happens, you gave me that. I need you to know that I know that." Cowery looked at him directly. "And I need you to understand that you gave me something too. You gave me proof that it matters. Every mission, every risk, every moment of fear, you're the proof that it's worth it. Not the medals or the commendations or the official attaboys. You, alive, writing letters, drinking coffee, being here." They stayed until the sun set, until the sky turned from blue to purple to black and the stars emerged in their thousands. The desert at night was cold, but neither of them moved to leave. They'd spent too much time in places where staying meant survival to be casual about leaving even comfortable places. That patience, that willingness to endure discomfort, was written into their bones now. It marked them as surely as scars and calluses, identified them to each other as members of the same tribe. Eventually, Cowery stood, brushed dust from her jeans. "We should head back." Webb followed, his limp more pronounced after sitting on cold rocks for hours. They walked to his truck in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling with words. On the drive back to Las Vegas, somewhere between the dark desert and the glowing city, Cowery said quietly, "Reaper 1-1. Webb glanced over. "Your call sign. I never asked why." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "My first deployment I had a different call sign. Viper. Standard aggressive name, same as half the fighter pilots get. I flew strike missions, mostly taking out buildings, vehicles, pre-planned targets. Clean. Clinical. Then one day my flight lead got hit by a MANPAD, had to eject over hostile territory. I stayed overhead for 2 hours below recommended altitude, burning fuel I didn't have, until the rescue bird could get there. I employed every weapon I had, keeping the enemy away from his position. When we got back to base, the rescue crew said I'd been like the Grim Reaper, just circling and dealing death to anyone who got close. The name stuck. And you kept it." "I kept it, because that's who I decided to be. Not the pilot who drops bombs and goes home. The pilot who stays. The Reaper who protects her people." Webb absorbed that. "Must get heavy sometimes, being that person." "Yeah," Cowery admitted, "but the alternative is being someone I couldn't respect, so I carry it." They didn't talk for the rest of the drive, but something had shifted between them, some final barrier of formality dissolved. When Webb dropped her off at her apartment, she paused before getting out. "Come to the squadron sometime. I'll get you a proper tour. Show you what the A-10 can actually do when it's not held together by duct tape and prayer." "I'd like that." She smiled, genuine, no professional distance. "Good, because you're part of the story now. The legend. Guys in my squadron talk about that mission like it's mythology. The rescue in the valley, the impossible landing. You deserve to see how it ends." But endings in military communities are rarely final. Stories continue, evolve, become teaching moments and cautionary tales and inspiration for the next generation. Cowiery's mission entered the official curriculum at the weapons instructor course, stripped of names but instantly recognizable to anyone who'd heard the unofficial version. Young pilots studied the engagement, the target priority decisions, the weapons employment sequence, the risk calculation of staying versus leaving. But the official version was sterile, all tactical analysis and procedural review. It missed the essential truth that someone had chosen to risk everything for someone they'd never met, and that choice had defined both their lives forever after. 3 years after the Valley, Cowery made major. She stayed in the instructor role, turning down opportunities to command flying squadrons, because she'd found her purpose in teaching the next generation how to think about close air support not as a tactical problem, but as a sacred responsibility. Webb visited Nellie's regularly, invited as a guest lecturer to speak about ground perspective, about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of close air support, about the communications failures that nearly killed him. His presentations were always uncomfortable for the pilots in the audience, confronting them with the human cost of timing delays and weapon malfunctions and decision paralysis. But discomfort was the point. Comfort was the enemy of the kind of urgency that saved lives. The two of them became a fixture at the annual Close Air Support Symposium, always presenting together, always honest about the mission that had connected them. They didn't sanitize it, didn't make it sound heroic in the recruiting poster sense. Instead, they made it sound terrifying and necessary and achingly human. Pilots left their presentations understanding that the voice on the radio wasn't just a unit designation. It was someone's son, someone's father, someone who wanted desperately to go home. Ground troops left understanding that the pilot overhead was flying something barely controllable, making decisions with incomplete information, choosing to accept risk because the alternative was abandoning someone who needed them. The gap between air and ground narrowed, just slightly, in those conference rooms. One particular story from their presentations always hit hardest. Webb told it from his perspective. The moment when his radio died, when he thought he'd called for help but received only silence, when he assumed he'd been forgotten. Cowery told it from hers. The moment she received the call, already engaged with a different target, aircraft already damaged, having to choose between continuing her current mission or breaking off to help an unknown soldier in an unknown location with no backup and no guarantee of success. The choice seemed obvious in retrospect, but in the moment, it had been agonizing. She'd been protecting a convoy, actively employing weapons against an ambush. Leaving meant those soldiers would lose their air cover. Staying meant Webb would die. She'd chosen based on tone of voice the particular quality of desperation in Webb's radio call, barely 3 seconds of audio before his transmission cut out. That split-second judgment had been the difference between his life and death. Young pilots always asked the same question. How did you know you were making the right choice? Cowery's answer never varied. I didn't know, I guessed, I hoped. I made the best decision I could with the information I had and then committed to it completely. That's all you can ever do. It wasn't a satisfying answer. People wanted algorithms, decision matrices, clear protocols. But combat didn't offer clarity. It offered chaos and fear and the requirement to act anyway. The best Cowery could do was teach them to be comfortable with uncertainty, to trust their training and instincts, and to understand that perfect decisions didn't exist, only the ones you made and the ones you lived with afterward. Webb's answer to the same question was simpler and somehow more profound. She came. That's all that mattered. She came. In those 3 words was the entire social contract of close air support, the promise between air and ground that no words could adequately capture. She came. When it mattered most, when staying was dangerous and leaving was justified, when the outcome was uncertain and the cost potentially fatal, she came. That was the standard. That was what every pilot in the room was being asked to live up to. Not technical perfection or tactical brilliance, though those helped. Just the fundamental willingness to show up when someone needed you, regardless of the personal cost. The years accumulated. Webb married not Cowery, though people often assumed. He married a social worker he'd met through the VA, someone who understood trauma without having experienced combat, who could be patient with his difficult days without needing him to explain them. Cowery stayed single, married to the Air Force in the way that career pilots often were, finding her fulfillment in mission rather than relationship. They remained close friends, the kind of friendship that didn't require constant contact to maintain its intensity. They could go months without speaking and then pick up exactly where they'd left off, as if no time had passed. They were connected by something deeper than circumstance, by the moment when their lives had intersected at 90 degrees and forever after ran parallel. Webb named his first child Nora. No explanation offered to family members who asked where the unusual name came from, just a quiet, someone important. Cowery was at the hospital the day the baby was born, holding the small, warm weight while Webb and his wife slept, exhausted from labor. She looked down at the infant, at the perfect tiny face, and thought about the chain of choices that led to this moment. One decision in a valley 3 years ago. One choice to stay instead of leave. Now this child existed, would grow up and make her own choices, would perhaps never know that her existence was contingent on split-second judgment in a crisis moment half a world away. The weight of it was staggering. Not burden, exactly, but responsibility. The knowledge that her actions echoed forward in ways she could never fully predict or control. Webb recovered enough to find Cowery in the hospital room, saw her holding his daughter, and understood without words what she was thinking. "Hey," he said quietly, "you gave me this too, this whole life, everything." Cowery carefully transferred the baby back to her father's arms. "You would have done the same if our positions were reversed." "Maybe, but they weren't reversed. You were the one flying, you were the one who stayed, that's not nothing." "It's everything," Cowery corrected gently. "That's the problem. It's too much to be everything." She left the hospital feeling unsettled, drove back to Nellie's through the desert night, and sat in her quarters for a long time thinking about the weight of other people's lives, the burden of being someone's miracle, the impossibility of living up to the person they thought she was. She'd just been a pilot doing her job. She'd made a tactical decision based on training and assessment of the situation. But to Webb, she was the reason he breathed, the reason his daughter existed, the reason he had a future. How do you carry that? How do you wake up every morning knowing someone credits you with their entire existence? She didn't have an answer. She just kept flying, kept instructing, kept trying to pass on whatever wisdom she'd accumulated about staying when leaving was easier. That seemed like enough. It had to be enough. 5 years after the Valley, Cowery deployed again, this time to Syria. The operational tempo was different from Afghanistan, more strategic targets, less close air support, different rules of engagement. She missed the intimacy of working with ground troops, missed the radio calls from soldiers who needed her, missed being someone's lifeline instead of just another weapons platform in the air tasking order. 2 months into the deployment, she got a request through her squadron commander. A reporter from a major defense publication wanted to interview her about the Valley mission. It had come up during research on A-10 survivability, and military public affairs thought it would be good publicity for the aircraft program, which was perpetually threatened with retirement despite combat pilots' fierce loyalty to the platform. Cowery's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to be profiled, didn't want the story dissected and analyzed and turned into content for people who'd never understood what it meant to fly in combat. But her commander pushed back gently. "It's not about you, it's about the mission, about what this aircraft can do, about why we need to keep these airplanes flying." So she agreed with one condition: Webb had to be interviewed too. The story wasn't just about a pilot. It was about the connection between air and ground, about the partnership that made close air support work. Tell half the story, and you missed the entire point. The reporter was a former Army officer himself, which made the interview easier. He understood the culture, spoke the language, knew which questions would be answered and which would be deflected. They met at Nellie's during Cowery's mid-deployment leave, all three of them, reporter, pilot, and the soldier who'd been saved. The interview lasted 5 hours, sprawled across a conference room table covered with coffee cups and notepads. They walked through the mission chronologically. Webb's patrol, the ambush, the radio call, Cowery's decision to divert, the damaged aircraft, the weapons employment, the landing, the aftermath. But they also talked about the parts that didn't appear in after-action reports. The fear, the uncertainty, the weight of responsibility, the complicated feelings that came with being connected by trauma. The reporter was particularly interested in something Webb said about guilt, that he felt guilty for surviving when other soldiers in other valleys with other aircraft hadn't, guilty that his rescue had required someone else to risk their life, guilty that the attention on his story, somehow, overshadowed all the similar stories that never got told. Cowery admitted her own version of the same guilt. That staying had been the right decision for Webb, but meant leaving the convoy she'd been supporting. That other soldiers had been exposed to danger because of her choice. That she'd been lucky the outcome was good, but luck wasn't skill, and she couldn't guarantee she'd make the right choice next time. The article, when it published 3 months later, was titled "The Partnership of Survival." It went viral within military communities, shared across social media, discussed in ready rooms and barracks and VA hospitals. Not because it was particularly dramatic, the reporter had kept the tone measured, almost understated, but because it articulated something soldiers and pilots felt but rarely expressed. That combat was fundamentally about trust between people who'd never met, that the system only worked when individuals chose to exceed their duty requirements, that survival was often less about tactical excellence and more about someone deciding you were worth the risk. The Air Force loved it. The article became unofficial recruiting material, proof that the A-10 was still relevant, that close air support still mattered, that the bond between air and ground was worth maintaining. Cowery's squadron printed copies and posted them in the ready room. Other A-10 units did the same. Young pilots read it and understood, perhaps for the first time,